Hello everyone. We're going to do this again with RCIA and the formation process. I know you enjoyed watching Paul Mueller's church history. Thought we would do it again with our additional formation session that we've missed at this point. It's within the morality 3 topics that we choose during Lent. Patty Beach is one of our parishioners, also a now retired nurse, and I'll let her give her the rest of the credentials that are listed beyond her name here. But Patty has a wealth of information, not only from a medical standpoint, but understanding our ethical and religious directives, the dignity of the human person. She can holistically look at how we understand end-of-life issues in the Catholic context. So I'm going to let Patty talk about that. The difficult part about this presentation is usually we get a lot of questions. So Patty will try to bring up some of the questions that have come up in previous RCIA topics, and I will as well as we film this. So it's a little bit shorter session. It's not 2,000 years of church history in 2 hours. It's the understanding of the human person in the medical context and end-of-life issues in probably about 35 minutes. So thanks for watching this. And Patty Beach, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Joanne. As Joanne said, I have recently retired from St. Vincent Mercy Medical Center, and before that spent a lot of time in oncology and palliative care, both within the Mercy Health System as well as on national groups and ethics committees. So I'm pleased to be asked to come back today and give this presentation. I put my email address both on the first and the last slide. So if you have any questions that can be formulated in an email, please feel free to contact me, and I will do my best to respond. But I hope at the end of this, 35 minutes or so, that you will have a little bit of a better understanding of advanced care planning. What I plan to do is to give you a little bit of the background on some of the statements that have come through the Catholic Church in regards to advanced care planning, and then address in the state of Ohio some of the legal issues around these documents and personal issues around conversations and perhaps some difficult topics. Whenever I give this lecture, I am always reminded of 2 stories that I have shared over the years, and I think it gives a little bit of an idea of how uncomfortable some people are with this topic, end-of-life care. The first is about a man who goes to the doctor. He's not feeling well, and the doctor says, yes, you are really very, very ill. You're very sick, and you have 10 left. And the man says, well, 10 what? 10 months, 10 weeks, 10 days. And the doctor says, 9, 8, 7. Another man who also is very sick goes to the doctor, and the doctor again says, yes, you are very sick also, and you have 2 weeks left. And that man says, well, if I have 2 weeks left, I'll take the 2nd week in July and the 3rd week in September. So I think that those 2 men show that either we think we have so much control over what happens to us and our end-of-life care, or we have no control and ignore it completely. So what I'm hoping in these 35 minutes or so is that we reach maybe a little bit of a middle ground for you. Joanne, in her introduction, mentioned something about the ethical and religious directives. The ethical and religious directives I bring up here just to let you know that there is an underpinning for Catholic healthcare hospitals, Catholic healthcare systems. And I borrow from the words of Father Joseph Cardoni. Some of you may remember him as an assistant pastor here and his work with Mercy. He is currently the chief officer for mission and values for Bon Secours Mercy in Cincinnati. And he said that it's not that Catholic healthcare systems believe that Jesus is only in our system, but it is that we own it. We acknowledge the healthcare, the ministry of Jesus Christ in caring for the sick and the vulnerable. And the ethical and religious directives us some guidance in how to make both big decisions and little decisions. And even though, yes, healthcare is a business, we try to make the decisions based on the ethical and religious directives in a responsible way, like I said, in the ministry of Jesus. A lot of these slides you will have, of course, at your convenience, so you can read through them. Some of them are quite wordy. The next few slides that I put up, I want to give you some idea of what the Catholic Church has said over the years. So it's not like in 2020 with the pandemic or whatever else is going on in healthcare that we kind of came up with this idea. It really is that through the centuries almost, Catholic healthcare has been spoken to by church leaders and addresses the idea of what should be done and what should not be done. And this slide talks about the idea that we are always to care and to give care even when cure is not possible. When you listen to these next couple slides and read them, I want you to think one of the underlying principles that you will see through the years, through the decades, is that the individual gets to make the decision. So there is not one right answer that fits everybody. There is not one right way to approach every single problem. But the what we call the benefit and the burden is weighed by the individual. So the benefit of a medical treatment versus the burden of a medical treatment, taking into account physical, financial, spiritual, emotional benefits and burdens. The individual gets to make that decision, and that is why sometimes you will have different decisions made that are all still good decisions. And so what I have pulled out of here are some of the ethical and religious directives specifically related to the idea of what treatment is called for, what treatment is necessary. And again, this is another way of saying benefit versus burden, that the proportionate means are those that in the judgment of the patient offer a reasonable hope of benefit and do not impose excessive burden. And this goes on and says that, we are always for preserving life, but not preserving life at any cost. So a medical intervention is always weighed against the benefit and the burden. Now, for example, if somebody can eat, it is always right to feed them. But do you have to give them artificial means of nutrition? Again, when you talk about a medical procedure that includes maybe an IV or a feeding tube, you are going to weigh the benefit and the burden of that medical procedure, not the benefit and burden of feeding somebody. And we will talk, I've got one or two slides at the very end to address that in a little bit more detail as well. So if you decide that you don't want, for example, if you have a diagnosis of cancer and you decide that you don't want that next type of chemotherapy, that you are going to allow the natural course of the disease, you have weighed the benefit and the burden for you and your loved ones, and that's what you want to do. Again, looking at that decision in terms of benefit and burden is not the same as saying euthanasia, where the goal or the intent is to kill somebody. That is different than allowing the natural course of the disease. And again, I would ask you to think about things like that, and things like cancer treatment. People will, and you probably know people that have come up with different decisions even with the same type of cancer. I am kind of reminded of a couple examples from several years ago where a patient came into the palliative care unit, and we were talking about whether talk to him if we could, but if we couldn't, we talked to the family, and the family said, Dad always said that if he could not get well enough to ride his horses, then we should stop treatment. Now, I remember thinking at the time, many of us cannot ride horses and would still want treatment. But this man did articulate to his family in a way they could understand how much or how little treatment he wanted. Another woman who had a very advanced case and very aggressive case of an autoimmune disease called systemic lupus had a lot of respiratory problems, a lot of pain, a lot of mobility problems. And she, in a family meeting, because she was able to participate, very, very clearly said to myself and her treating physician, God gave you the ability to keep me breathing, to keep my heart beating. I don't care if I can't get out of bed. I don't care if I can't talk. You are to do everything to keep my body working. And leaving the door open in her estimation and her look at the benefit versus the burden, leaving the door open for a miracle. So again, those are two extremes of people who articulated what their benefit and burden would be, and I ask you to think about that. Some of the other things said by the church in relation to some of these things is, again, that you are not obliged to use every means possible. Said or taught in the late 15th, 16th century. You don't have to take every treatment available just because it is available. And then the circumstances, the person's place and time. Again, this is another way to say benefit versus burden. And again, in 1995, Pope John Paul's teaching reinforced that. So that brings us to what do you do with this information as a Catholic, as an individual, and what we do in our society is we call it advanced care planning. Advanced care planning in the state of Ohio includes the documents, and we do like our paperwork, but it includes the documents of a living will, a surrogate or a proxy, and the donation of organs. The other advanced directive that falls under this is that whether you have a do not resuscitate order or not, and that is with you and the physician. The other three are independent. You make those decisions. Hopefully you make those decisions while you are competent and able to make a decision. A living will, that will come into play if you have a terminal illness, if you are not expected to live. So some of these decisions that might be made earlier than that would not really fall under a living will. So it's a document that has some limited usefulness. It is particularly useful if there's some disagreement among family members and the patient themselves cannot speak. What this slide tells you is that the process of decision making, communicating those decisions, is made by the person themselves. They can change their mind. They can, again, draft a new document, have a new conversation, appoint a different proxy. Once they cannot make decisions for themselves, though, the last of their documentation will hold the weight of law. One thing I want to make sure that you understand is that importance of identifying a proxy. Asking yourself, who will we as in the healthcare team, who will my doctor, my nurses, who will talk for me if I can't talk for myself? Now, if you don't tell us who to talk to, this is how it's going to go in the state of Ohio. We will talk to your spouse, and it doesn't matter if you and your spouse have not talked. If you are still legally married, that spouse will make decisions for you. The spouse, then if you don't have a spouse, we will talk to your parents. If you don't have parents, then we talk to the majority of your adult children. If you don't have adult children, then we talk to the majority of your siblings. And then it kind of goes after that, aunts, uncles, grandparents, those kinds of things. But if you don't like that order that I just laid out there, your spouse, your parents, your adult children, your adult siblings, then you have to tell us, who should we talk to? And I can tell you that it is very difficult when you don't do that, because sometimes the firstborn thinks that they should make the decisions. Sometimes maybe you've lived with another child, or maybe you've got a partner that you live with, but you've never, married. All of those things cannot be taken into consideration the way you might want them to. So I ask you to take into consideration who will make decisions for you, put that in writing, and let the healthcare team know that. So once you have decided, and also I guess the other important thing with the proxy, once you have decided who will speak for you, make sure that they know that they will speak for you. That is quite a burden and quite a surprise, can be a traumatic surprise if somebody is not ready for that or didn't know that they would be speaking for you. So the advanced directives that I alluded to, the healthcare power of attorney, that surrogate, who will speak for you when you cannot speak for yourself? The living will that comes into play in limited circumstances, particularly if your condition is considered terminally ill. Anatomical gifts, what we put when we go to renew our driver's license. Do you want to be an organ donor or not? Many people never mention that to their family, and their family is often surprised once they understand the wishes of the person, though they will try to honor those as well. And then the do not resuscitate order is the only one under the advanced directives that you cannot make yourself a do not resuscitate. You cannot, as some people have said, have tattooed across your chest, no CPR, and expect that the EMS squad will honor that if they are called to your house or to an accident. You have to have a physician's order that says do not resuscitate to be followed legally by EMS and other healthcare professionals. Again, I would pause for questions here, and I am, glad to take any by email if that's if you have thought of something. But I do want to mention that sometimes some of the hard decisions that have to be made, the artificial nutrition and hydration, I want to speak to that for a moment. But before we get to that one even, it is pain control. Sometimes people think that they have to have a certain amount of pain. And I understand that people are reluctant to use opioids, narcotics, because of all of the troubles that has caused when they are misused or when they are abused. But as far as the teachings of the Catholic Church goes, and once again, I have sat in lectures and with Father Cardone and sat in ethic committee discussions, pain control is not against the Catholic Church. If there is a way that you can do and have your pain controlled, live a more comfortable life, that is very well accepted within the teachings of the Catholic Church. Artificial nutrition and hydration, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, and I would just again articulate that it is always, always, always right to feed somebody. If somebody doesn't have the ability to pick up the fork and feed themselves, yes, we feed them. That is not the same as artificial nutrition and hydration. Artificial nutrition and hydration, now you're talking about you need to consent to a medical procedure to either have intravenous access or a feeding tube placed in your stomach. And that medical procedure also has benefit and burden to it. It may be painful. It may, be annoying afterwards, and you don't like the feel of that. You may not tolerate the liquid feedings as well as we might have anticipated, and have some vomiting, have some what we call aspiration, where the tube feedings go down into your lungs, which cause breathing problems. Maybe your kidneys aren't working right. We give you the fluids. You can't get rid of the fluids, so you have some swelling. So there's all different kinds of things with the benefit versus the burden. And I'm not saying that right now, sitting there in front of your computer, feeling fine, that you can make that decision. What I'm saying is, if that decision has to be made, that you make it with your physician, and you talk about the benefit and the burden, what you would want. This talks about some of the contraindications, why you may not, you think that if you do artificial nutrition and hydration, somebody will live longer, somebody will live better. The research does not always bear that out. The evidence shows that particularly people who have advanced cases of dementia and maybe have forgotten how to eat or have the inability to swallow will actually do worse with the artificial nutrition and hydration, and may actually die sooner. So again, those are discussions you need to have with a medical professional that is aware of the circumstances of whatever you are trying to make a decision about. Which brings me to one of the most important slides of this talk, is talking. Yes, we talk about having the papers signed, the living will signed, the surrogacy designation, having all that paperwork. And truly that's important, especially if there's a conflict, but even before all of that, it is important to have a conversation. Start the conversation with your loved ones. These resources up here are a couple that are online that talk about what kinds of questions to ask, how to address that, how to maybe get over the barrier that, I don't want to talk about that. My mother said to me once, she said, Patty, I don't want any machines. The truth is that you can barely walk into the front door of a hospital or any kind of a medical facility without having a machine that takes your temperature, that dispenses the medication, that regulates your IV, that maybe helps you to breathe. Well, as we talked, that's what my mother meant. She meant that, if she was in an accident and she had to go to the intensive care unit for an overnight stay, those machines would be okay. What she didn't want, as we talked more, was to be tied only to a machine, to have machines that breathe for her, to have machines that stimulate her heartbeat, to have machines that feed her. She did not want that kind of a life if that became the decision. So the words that you choose are very, very important, and I ask you to consider that both with your family and as you're talking to your healthcare provider, maybe a nurse, maybe a physician, but that you understand what they're saying. Not that anybody has a crystal ball that works 100% of the time, but that you understand these might be the side effects. So if we put you on that breathing machine and we don't think you'll be able to get off, the closest nursing facility that can take care of you is 35 miles away, and can your 72-year-old spouse make that trip to visit you? Those are all things that, again, sitting in front of your computer listening to me today, you can't possibly weigh all of that. But as you start a conversation, and if you go to some of these resources, they will ask that you start these conversations when you become an adult. So that is 18 and over. And just have a sense of what your values are. What kind of treatment would you accept? Not that you can say, gee, this, and this, because you cannot make a list. But you might want to say how independent you would expect to be. how much care you would accept from either a loved one or from a facility. And that would help. If you cannot agree or if you cannot consent to different procedures, that will help whoever your surrogate is, whoever is making decisions for you, to make decisions that would be most in line with what you would do. Do not be afraid of naming a surrogate, because what happens, if we can talk to you, it is always, always, always the patient's decision. It is always your decision to weigh the pros and the cons, to weigh the benefits and the burdens. Only when we cannot talk to you because of whatever incapacity that you have will we look to a surrogate. Finally, in conclusion, the task of medicine is to care even when it cannot cure. And again, I gave you some examples from the Catholic Church teachings as well as the ethical and religious directives. Not that those are only in Catholic healthcare systems, but they are things to look at for good care. Technology must be evaluated, not used blindly. You know, when antibiotics first came out, gee, should we or shouldn't we, was the same thing as now, you know, some of the other decisions that you hear being made today about ventilators or heart pumps or vaccines. Effective pain control and relief of suffering in all its forms is crucial. It is not necessary to suffer just because you believe it is the Catholic way. Avoid over-treatment or deliberate killing. Again, you make the decision whether you want a treatment or not, but never ever would it be appropriate, correct, right, or within the Catholic Church teachings to deliberately end a life. The importance of advanced care planning, which includes appointing a durable power of attorney for healthcare decisions, the surrogate, the proxy, there's a lot of names for that, but I hope I made the point that tell us as in tell your healthcare people who to talk to if they can't talk to you. The patient or the patient's DPOA determines that proportionate or disproportionate, that benefit versus burden, the advantages and the disadvantages. So again, I am happy to come with you via technology today. If you have any questions that you think can be addressed by an email, please don't hesitate to contact me. Joanne has other contact information if you need to talk more. Thank you.
Wonderful, Patty. Thank you. I have a couple of questions and comments that I'd like to bring to the group. But first, in case you can't read Patty's email address here because it's light, it's patricia.beach3@gmail.com. So that's great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Patty, can you go back to some of the resources? You had a page that listed resources. I think it's about 3 back. Here we go.
Yeah.
Do any of those resources then have blank forms that talk about that quality of life that you can communicate with them?
So the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, if you go onto their website, you'll be able to go down to the specific state and you would see forms. When I talk about surrogacy forms, when I talk about a living will document even, you don't need an attorney to fill those out. You can fill them out. You need a witness to witness that yes, you did sign that under no duress, but that witness cannot be part of your family. So there are specific forms by state under that. There are also some documents, particularly under the Conversation Project and the National Institute on Aging, that will give you some questions if you want to start that conversation with your family. How to bring it up, maybe things to cover, that maybe can ease you into that. It may take more than one conversation. In fact, I would go out on a limb here and say more than likely it will take, you're not going to cover this all in one conversation. Maybe you're sitting there with your adult children and they can only hear so much, and then you come back to it.
Very good. Thank you, Patty. Couple things too, but I'm going to turn off the screen and join you.
Okay.
Just to kind of talk a little bit about things that have come up before. So let
Okay.
me just turn that off. First of all, I know you have a wealth of information, Patty, to share on this. So usually this topic goes on for at least an hour and 15 minutes. So, I'm sad that we can't participate that way. Couple situations that you mentioned. Administering pain medications.
Mm-hmm.
That sometimes at end of life can make end of life happen sooner. But that doesn't mean it's wrong to have those medications. My parents were on hospice. That end-of-life kit that has morphine in it could be administered to alleviate any anxiety and pain and whatnot that my parents were experiencing. But it can also quicken death. But the intent is not to quicken death. The intent is everything in that. So the intent is to bring comfort.
And Joanne, that's a good point, and again, something that probably takes a little bit of thinking about, but why are you doing something? And that, broadly the benefit versus the burden. But if you are giving a pain medication to relieve suffering, to relieve a physical pain, or even if you're giving an anxiety medication to relieve that anxiety, that unknown fear, primary intention is it really is so important. Now, that doesn't mean that these medications, like Joanne said, are strong medications in some situations, have some side effects. One of the side effects that seems to get a lot of play in the media, but really is not seen that often, is that it can depress respirations. So if in the hands of a healthcare professional, they would assess, how are you breathing? What do you expect? But even then, if the intention of giving that medication is to relieve suffering, then you accept some of the unintended side effects, which, as Joanne said, might be to slow your breathing down, or even in very, very rare cases, stop your breathing. But that was not your intent.
Thank you.
That is really critical.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patty.
And sometimes, the other thing I would say with that, if you are in a hospice situation or in a hospital situation and you're struggling with that for a loved one, certainly talk with the physician and nurse, but also ask to talk to the chaplain. Some of these things are not always black and white, and they're not always yes or no. And sometimes it's not even always physical. It's about, it sometimes a chaplain can be an important part of your care team as well.
Good, thank you. And referring back to the document, talking about quality of life, how important that is. Those conversations are difficult to have. I teach a medical ethics class at Mercy, and looking at some situations that people were in, and I think of the Terry Schiavo case in Florida, but recognizing what kind of quality of life you would want to have is very important. So even at a young age, to have this conversation. And then just to share my own experience. I have 7 brothers and sisters. My parents designated me as their advocate, their power of attorney, medical and financial. And you kind of don't want those conversations, but my parents continued with those. Well, my mother had dementia, my dad had heart, lung, and kidney disease, but seemed to function well with that. But we were concerned about my mom and her dementia. So I talked about hospice. Many people don't want to talk about hospice, but hospice is there to increase the quality of life that we have left and to make us as comfortable as possible. But anyhow, so we called a number of hospices. They came in and they assessed my mother, and they said, well, she's not ready for hospice at this point. But my dad qualified. Well, all of a sudden it changed the picture. Like, Dad didn't want to qualify. Dad wanted Mom qualified. But Dad, with his heart, lung, and kidney disease, did. All of a sudden that really spurred conversations to say, whoa, how much do I want to hold on to life? And at that point, my father then said to me, I value life so much, I want to hang on to any of it in light of this. So he really didn't want hospice, but nevertheless, it spurred that conversation. My father did pass before my mother, and then of course my mother had dementia, and a couple years later she passed as well. But what I mean to say is, what hard conversations, but how critical they are, especially for the person that's left to make the decision. You want to make right decisions out of love for that person.
So your comments remind me of a couple things as well, Joanne. And the first is that what I would try to emphasize with any family having these difficult conversations, like I said earlier, there is more than one right decision. Good. And it may differ for that person. And if you are making decisions for a loved one, what I would want you to know is that decisions made in love are right. When you make a decision because you love somebody, that is a good decision. You cannot, or at least try not to second guess yourself. Try not to say, oh, well, when the lady down the street, So decisions made in love are good decisions, even though there may be a number of different decisions or different ways to approach that. The other value with hospice, and I know this talk is not specifically about hospice, is the value, though, that hospice brings to the family. And sometimes, when I have had conversations with, oh, I'm not ready for hospice yet. Well, no, but this way your family, if something happens in the middle of the night, they know who to call. And sometimes, people will do things for their family that they might say no to for themselves because they're not there yet. But, oh, if it'll help my family, sure, I'll do it, So that would be another consideration.
Good points, and I love ending on that love. There's many options, but done in love, again, that intent and that desire in love will lead us to the right decision.
Yeah. Conversations are difficult, and again, I go back to my mother telling me several times over the years, honey, if anything happens to me, I have had a good life, don't even worry about that. Oh, Mom, don't worry, everything's okay. How many times do I go back to that now, knowing that she really did feel good? And how many times do I tell that to my adult daughters now, who also don't want to hear it, but maybe someday it will bring them some comfort as well.
Very well said, Patty. And of course, the purpose of this topic is looking at life from conception to natural death. How we understand that natural death is critical, but as you said, Patty, euthanasia, assisted suicide, that is not ever what a Catholic teaching would be. It's always about our intent and understanding our directives. So anyhow, thank you for coming. It's always a delight to hear you again, no matter how much I hear this.
Thanks, Joanne.
And the only loss is all of you not being here.
Yes,
But thank you, Patty.
You're welcome.
It's a delight to have you again.